The late afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows of the Harrison mansion, casting long golden shadows across the polished marble floors. Richard Harrison stepped through the heavy oak front door, his leather briefcase hitting the floor with a soft thud. The house felt different somehow, quieter than usual, yet filled with an unfamiliar warmth that seemed to drift from the direction of the kitchen. Richard loosened his silk tie and ran a hand through his graying hair. The business trip to Tokyo had stretched longer than expected, 3 weeks of endless meetings and corporate negotiations that had left him feeling more exhausted than accomplished. At 52, he had built an empire worth hundreds of millions, but lately, the victories felt hollow, each success adding another layer to the wall between him and the life he thought he wanted. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 5 times, its deep, resonant tone echoing through the empty corridors. Mrs. Patterson, his longtime housekeeper, had mentioned in her brief phone call that she would be taking extended leave to care for her ailing mother. He had expected to return to a house managed by the cleaning service, sterile and efficient, but something felt different. There were sounds coming from the kitchen, gentle clattering of dishes, the soft murmur of voices, and what sounded suspiciously like laughter. Richard set down his briefcase and walked slowly toward the back of the house, his footsteps muffled by the Persian rugs that lined the hallway. The sounds grew clearer as he approached. Definitely conversation, definitely laughter, and the unmistakable aroma of something delicious cooking. His stomach rumbled quietly, reminding him that airplane food had been his only sustenance for the past 12 hours. As he rounded the corner into the kitchen, Richard stopped short, his hand still resting on the doorframe. The scene before him was so unexpected, so completely different from what he had imagined, that for a moment he wondered if he had walked into the wrong house. At the large center island stood a young woman, perhaps in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and wearing a simple blue dress covered by a white apron. She was stirring something in a large pot, her movements graceful and confident. But it wasn't the presence of a new maid that caught him off guard. It was his son. Michael sat on one of the high stools at the island, his 19-year-old frame hunched slightly forward as he watched the woman cook. Richard hadn't seen his son this engaged, this present, in years. Michael's usual sullen expression had been replaced by something Richard had almost forgotten existed. Genuine interest, even contentment. "The secret," the woman was saying, her voice carrying a slight accent Richard couldn't quite place, "is to add the herbs at just the right moment. Too early, and they lose their brightness. Too late, and they don't have time to blend with the other flavors." Michael nodded seriously, as if this information was the most important thing he had ever heard. "My mom used to say something similar about her garden," he said quietly. "She said timing was everything." Richard felt his breath catch. Michael rarely spoke about his mother, who had passed away when he was 12. The boy had essentially shut down after that, retreating into video games and online worlds, rejecting every attempt at connection Richard had tried to make. "She sounds like she was a wise woman," the maid replied gently, tasting the sauce with a wooden spoon. "Would you like to try this? Tell me if it needs more salt." As Michael leaned forward to taste the sauce, Richard noticed something else that made him pause. His son was smiling, not the forced, polite smile he reserved for social occasions, but a real, unguarded expression of pleasure. "It's perfect," Michael said, and the woman beamed at him as if he had just solved a complex mathematical equation. Richard cleared his throat softly, not wanting to startle them, but needing to announce his presence. Both heads turned toward him, and he saw surprise flash across both faces, surprise, but not guilt or fear, which struck him as curious. "Mr. Harrison," the woman said, immediately setting down her spoon and smoothing her apron. "I'm so sorry. I didn't hear you come in. I'm Elena Martinez. Mrs. Patterson arranged for me to help manage the house while she's away. Elena's been teaching me to cook, Michael said, his voice carrying more enthusiasm than Richard had heard in years. Real cooking, not just heating up frozen dinners. Richard looked between them, taking in the scene more carefully now. The kitchen, usually pristine and largely unused except for the coffee maker and microwave, showed signs of actual cooking. There were fresh herbs on the counter, vegetables in various stages of preparation, and the warm, lived-in feeling that comes from a space being truly used. I hope you don't mind, Elena continued, her dark eyes meeting his directly. Michael mentioned that you both usually eat separately, and I thought it might be nice to have a proper meal ready for when you returned home. The word home hung in the air between them. Richard realized that for years this place had been a house, expensive, impressive, but not really a home. Not since Sarah had died and he had thrown himself into work, leaving Michael to grow up in the care of housekeepers and nannies. I don't mind at all, Richard said slowly, setting his jacket on one of the chairs. What are you making? Elena's teaching me to make arroz con pollo, Michael said, but the real kind, not from a box. She's been telling me about her grandmother's recipe. Elena smiled, and Richard noticed how the expression transformed her entire face. My abuela always said that food is love made visible. When you cook for someone, you're taking care of them in the most basic, important way. Richard felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of tension he hadn't even realized he had been carrying. He pulled out one of the stools and sat down across from his son, the island between them, but somehow not feeling like a barrier for the first time in years. Could I help? He asked, the words surprising himself as much as anyone else. Elena's smile widened. Of course. Michael, why don't you show your father how to prepare the sofrito? For the next hour, Richard found himself chopping onions and peppers under his son's careful instruction, following Elena's patient guidance, as she explained the importance of building flavors layer by layer. The conversation flowed naturally, moving from cooking techniques to stories about Elena's family in El Salvador, to Michael's tentative sharing of memories about his mother's attempts at cooking. She wasn't very good at it, Michael admitted with a laugh, but she never gave up trying. Remember, Dad, that time she tried to make that fancy French dish, and the smoke alarm went off 3 times. Richard did remember, and suddenly the memory didn't hurt the way it usually did. Instead, it felt warm, like something precious that had been safely stored away and was now being brought back into the light. Your mother had many wonderful qualities, Richard said gently, but following recipes wasn't one of them. As they sat down to eat together at the kitchen table, something that hadn't happened in Richard's own house in years, he realized that Elena had given them something far more valuable than a meal. She had created a space where connection was possible again, where the careful walls they had built around themselves could be temporarily lowered. The arroz con pollo was delicious, but more important than the food was the conversation, the easy way Michael talked about his classes, his plans for the future, things he hadn't shared with his father in years. Elena listened to both of them with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions and sharing her own stories in return. As the evening wound down and Elena began cleaning up, insisting that her employers should relax, Richard realized that he didn't want this feeling to end. The house felt alive again, filled with the kind of warmth that no amount of money could buy. Elena, he said as she gathered the last of the dishes, I hope you'll consider staying on permanently. We could use someone who understands that a house isn't really a home without people caring for each other in it. She paused, dish towel in hand, and looked at him thoughtfully. I would like that very much, Mr. Harrison, but only if we can have family dinners like this regularly. A house this big shouldn't feel so empty. Michael looked up from his phone. When had he stopped staring at it during conversations? Anne nodded eagerly. Could we, Dad?